I'd like to introduce the panel to you today. On my close right is Maree Crabbe. Maree Crabbe has worked with young people and on issues affecting young people for over 20 years. She's developed and delivered programs focusing on sexual violence prevention, sexual diversity and prevention of sexually transmitted infections. Maree is co-founder and project coordinator of Reality and Risk, Pornography, Young People and Sexuality, a violence prevention project addressing the influence of pornography on young people. And if anyone was at that session earlier, it was pretty amazing. Maree's articles on young people, sexuality and pornography have been published in online print media. She's co-producer, co-director of a documentary film, Love and Sex in an Age of Pornography. She's broadcast on SBS in Australia and also in Israel, Germany, Poland, and author of In the Picture, a secondary school resource addressing the influence of explicit sexual imagery. I'd like to introduce Professor Bob Pease. Bob Pease is Professor of Critical Social Work at Deakin University in Geelong. He's been involved in pro-feminist politics with men for many years and was a founding member of Men Against Sexual Assault in Melbourne. He's published extensively on masculinity, politics and critical social work practice, including 4 books as single author and 10 books as co-editor, as well as numerous book chapters and journal articles. His most recent books include Undoing Privilege, Unearned Advantage in a Dividend World, Men and Masculinities Around the World, Transforming Men's Practices, Men, Masculinities and Methodologies, and The Politics of Recognition and Social Injustice, Transforming Subjectivities and New Forms of Resistance. I think we're in for a good conversation. I'd also like to introduce you to Patricia, we call her Paddy Kinnersly. Paddy Kinnersly is the CEO of Women's Health Grampians, one of 11 regional and metropolitan women's health services in Victoria. She works in partnership with policymakers and service providers, providing expertise and skills to address women's health issues, particularly focused on sexual and reproductive health and the primary prevention of violence against women. Paddy is the current convener of the Victorian Women's Health Service and a board member of the Australian Women's Health Network National Board. She was recently the review panel leader for the development of the AWHN policy position paper, Health and Primary Prevention of Violence Against Women. Over the last 18 months, her organisation has developed the ACT and Work program, a workplace-based primary prevention program aimed at challenging sexism, discrimination and violence against women in the Grampians region. I'm just going to read you a little story. This is called Bodies by the River. A passerby sees a body floating down a river and calls 000. Emergency service workers arrive and haul the person out. Paramedics start resuscitation and rush the victim to the emergency, which is some distance away. Shortly after, the doctor announces that while everything possible was done to save the victim, sadly he's died. Sometime later, a similar event happens again, and sensing an ideal political opportunity, the local Member of Parliament lobbies the Minister for Health to have an ambulance station built nearby, complete with advanced rescue equipment and special resuscitation training, so that this tragedy might never happen again in our community. A journalist at the press conference pointedly asks why nets and fences could not be installed in the bridge located upstream, and this would be more effective and cheaper than maintaining services downstream. He was promptly escorted away from the meeting by the politician's aides. At that point, I guess I'd like to call on my panel, perhaps Maree first, to respond to that little story. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So, as the story indicates, Prevention is about preventing something before it occurs rather than responding to it once it's occurred. I think it's useful to think about prevention on a continuum where at one end we have tertiary prevention, which is often called intervention, that involves support and treatment, and at the other end we have primary prevention, and in the middle we have early intervention, which is where individuals and groups who are identified as being at risk are worked with in order to try to prevent it. So it's a continuum. Now, I'd suggest that putting a net up on the bridge is not really primary prevention. It's early intervention, and on the continuum, it's closer to intervention than to primary prevention. Primary prevention is about understanding the causes. Are people jumping off the bridge upstream? And if so, why? Why are they doing that? Then acting to prevent that happening by addressing those underlying causes amongst broad groups of people or whole populations even. So in relation to violence against women, primary prevention means understanding the factors that promote and nurture violence or create the conditions in which it's most likely to occur. That's what's referred to as the underlying determinants or the key underlying determinants or the causes, which we've heard a bit about today. Then disassembling those factors wherever they occur to reduce the risks of violence. So the two key challenges then are to understand what are the causes and how can we effectively address those causes, disassemble those wherever they happen. So, as we've heard, research indicates that there are underlying determinants to gender-based violence or violence against women, and they include rigid gender stereotypes, unequal gender relations, and violence-supportive attitudes. So in order to address these effectively, we need to understand these factors. We need to understand how they operate and where, and what they mean for individuals and relationships, for organisations and communities, and for society more broadly. And addressing these factors is going to require multiple strategies across multiple contexts. So for example, as we've heard, in kindergartens, in schools, in sporting environments, in faith groups, in workplaces, in media and popular culture, in community services and the corporate sector. It means working with children, young people, men and women, with Indigenous communities, with other cultural groups, with rural communities and women with disabilities. So my work in recent years has been about supporting people to understand and to address the ways in which pornography reinforces the key underlying determinants of gender-based violence through education resource development, engagement in public conversations, and advocacy and training. Porn is now incredibly pervasive. About 30% of all internet traffic is porn-related. It commonly portrays gendered stereotypes, unequal gender relations, and gendered aggression. In fact, it not only conveys these things, it says that they're sexy. It eroticises the underlying determinants of gender-based violence. A content analysis of best-selling porn found that 88% of scenes contained physical aggression and 48% of scenes contained verbal aggression, and 94% of that aggression was directed towards women. And it's influencing sexual and gender understandings, expectations and experiences, which I could go into a lot more detail about, but I won't. So I think this work is just one part in a puzzle of a whole big puzzle that it is what primary prevention is about. And I think about multiple reinforcing strategies in terms of, if young people or if the general community gets messages in a whole range of places about that men are more important than women, that they're unequal. They see it in the media when the experts that speak are men. They see it, you have it policed in kindergarten when, certain things are things that boys do and certain things are things that girls do. Music videos, a whole range of places when we see how our female Prime Minister is treated, for example. So if we have multiple messages that reinforce that women aren't equal, then if we're going to shift this, then we need to have those messages reinforced, the opposite of those messages reinforced across a whole range of contexts. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Maree. Bob, would you like to respond to the little story we had?
There's been a lot of different versions of this parable, and I'm sure it's a parable that'll be familiar to many people in the room. The version that I'm most familiar with is quite different from this one, and it has somebody going up the river to get the bastard who's throwing them off, which is a slightly different version. And I agree with Maree that the kind of solution in the parable that's being presented is much more the kind of safety net solution, and it's certainly not preventing. And even the version of the person who's going up to get the bastard who's throwing them off isn't really dealing with prevention either, because one of the problems with all the versions of that parable that I've read is that the bodies floating down the river are seen as passive victims. And what we know is about people's capacity to resist and struggle against oppression. That's what the last 40 years of the women's movement has surely told us all. That's why we're talking about this issue today. What we know from cross-cultural global research is that the countries that have the most progressive gender equality policies and most progressive policies on men's violence against women are those countries that have the strongest autonomous women's movements that are outside of the state and that are continuing to put pressure on the state. And that's what this parable doesn't get at. It doesn't get at that empowerment process. It also doesn't really capture the kind of broader complicity within the community in terms of it doesn't encourage people, the members of the community, to reflect on how they might be complicit in some way with the bodies floating down the river. It kind of separates the rescuers, those that are going to deal with the issue, from reflecting on their own behaviour. And so I've got real problems with the parable. I mean, I hope the parable was given to us so we could deconstruct it, interrogate it, critique it, and let's get rid of it, because it's not a useful parable for understanding what we're on about. That's the first comment. The second comment is...
Go, Bob.
Look, I've got a real problem with this language of primary prevention. I know I upset people in the public health field when I raised this issue, but I'm going to raise it because I have to, because the language we use to talk about the issues limits and constrains us. And the problem I have with the language of primary prevention is that it comes from biomedical discourse, which was really about trying to prevent a disease before it occurs. Now, violence is not a disease. And it's also not analogous to a disease. And so the kind of primary prevention notion, which was always about stopping a disease before it occurs. And of course now it translates into stopping violence before it occurs. And how do we stop violence before it occurs? Well, we change people's attitudes. The same way that, public health promotion tries to change people's attitudes about a disease. And I'm sorry, but that's not how we do it. And we've got to step outside of that public health framing of primary, secondary and tertiary prevention, because it locks us into a conceptual frame that prevents us and inhibits us from understanding what the real causes are. Because what public health talks about, they don't talk about causes, they talk about risk factors and determinants. Determinants and risk factors are not causes. They're not causes. And even though we talk about gender inequality as a determinant or a risk factor, it doesn't really get to the heart of what the issue is. Now, it doesn't get to and even when they talk about, when we start to look at interventions, even when gender inequality is recognised as a determinant, all the kind of interventions are about changing attitudes and behaviours. Now, I'm not saying changing attitudes and behaviours is wrong, but it's not getting to the heart of the issue. I prefer to talk about the structural relations of gender inequality, and I've been around long enough now. I think I was saying to someone at lunchtime, I think I'm getting more polemical as I get older, because I went to my first Violence Against Women conference in the 1970s, and I get frustrated that we haven't moved as much as I would have liked to have thought we might have done. But the language of the 70s, we talked about the structural relations of gender as patriarchy. And we talked about it, and we identified what the sites of patriarchy were. We identified them as paid work, as the household, as sexuality, as culture, as the state. and we talked about violence against women, men's violence against women, as one of the sides of patriarchy, and what the feminists of the 70s understood. And I know I sound like a dinosaur talking about this, but I think we've lost something, because what they understood was that you cannot prevent violence against women. And it is not preventable unless you dismantle and abolish patriarchy. You've got to challenge and transform all of the sites of patriarchy if we want to get rid of men's violence against women. And we have to name it as such. I mean, I've been in so many forums where we talk about violence against women, we've moved away from that gender-neutral language to some extent. But when are we going to foreground by gendering the perpetrators of men's violence against women? And yet because it's implicit, it's understood we're talking about men, but why don't we say it? Why are we not upfront about saying it? This is about men's violence against women within patriarchy. Now, that's what we have to do. And I think we have to talk about men's violences. Not only, and one of the statistics that was interesting up there was that men are more likely to be the victims of men's violence than women are, if you look at it globally. I mean, it enables us to talk about men's violence against men as well, and that is also gendered. Men's violence against women is not the only gendered form of violence. Men's violence against men is gendered as well. We need to see men's violence against women as one of the many violences that men do. And I think so that would suggest a shift in focus. So I run patriarchy awareness workshops for men. I educate men about patriarchy. That's what I do. I mean, I don't always call them that. I don't know, you know, that always comes in as the workshop unfolds, but that's what I do. I educate men about patriarchy, and I think we have to name the issues of patriarchy, because all of us as men are complicit in and are part of patriarchy. None of us are innocent and removed from it. We hear that majority of men are not physically violent. That's to reassure men that they're not part of the problem. If you're a man who grows up into patriarchy, you are part of the problem, you're not disconnected from it, you've got responsibilities to do something about it. We need to understand that complicity, and we have to educate men about patriarchy, how it works, how they're part of it, and what they then might do to sort of challenge it.
Thanks, Bob. I'd just like to comment that probably whilst the term patriarchy may have slipped a little bit off our the words that we use, it's sort of a little bit outside of the vocabulary we now use. I think that at the back of our minds we all know when we're talking about gender inequality, we know that involves some kind of challenge around patriarchy. So I'm happy to kind of tease that out a bit further as we go along. I'd now like to call on Patty to maybe she can either respond to Bob or whatever she's got on her script. Go for it, Patty.
I'm deeply sorry I've gone third. So I'll sort of address a couple of slightly different things. And that is the women's health sector. We work across the state in regional settings. So our work is with local communities. It is based on the determinants of health, and it focuses on primary prevention. So I'm not going to change my whole world around because of what Bob said today. So let me just keep going down that path. So in responding to this scenario, we will combine our understanding of the determinants of health with the known evidence, local intelligence and data, and we'll work with local decision makers to address the causes of why people are jumping over. Not necessarily putting up a bridge at the net at the top. We want to go back a step earlier and look at why people are making that choice. We're working with rural people a lot of the time, and rural people, and many of you are that, are passionate, they're proud, they're smart, but they don't particularly like being told what to do by city folk. They don't like blow-ins too much, and they particularly don't like tossers who talk on their mobile phones in cafes. They also don't care what department you come from, what the new regional boundaries are, or who funds you. So when we're working with local communities on primary prevention of violence against women, we must, and we do, respect the diversity of rural communities, and within rural communities. What works here might not work 15 kilometres up the road, and we have to respect that. We respect that everyone has a role, whether it's the CEO or the street sweeper or anybody else in the town, everyone has a role because they're all involved. We have to leave our egos at the door. The people who live and work and love and learn in communities are the experts about those communities. We respect that the champions in communities are community members who other communities members listen to and learn from, not the people we choose. And we must work with people who want to work with us. Somebody in my team eloquently said, we must roll the shit downhill. I hadn't thought of it like that before, but we don't need to pick the hardest paths. And we need to understand that rural people, like all people, have unconscious biases that mean the impact and the speed of the work varies according to people's unconscious bias. And it's a discussion that I think we have to have and unpack a little more, unconscious bias, because we talk a lot in our sector about the things that we take for granted, about the unequal distribution of power, about the rigid social norms. But we also have to remember that those unconscious biases are with us from before we can talk. So we know that we start to learn about men and women and their various roles right from when we're babies, and they are so ingrained in us that we rarely even look at them. And so that's the things like, aren't you a pretty little princess? Aren't you a strong little fella? Through to doctors are men and nurses are women. Mum gets the lunches ready, Dad does the stuff outside. Bosses are men, receptionists are women. And I can, keep going on that line for 5 or 8 pages. There are more men in leadership. The people we see on TV are more likely to be men, reading the news or in sport, all of those sorts of things. And then there's the media and their role, and that blokes drive utes and drink VBs, or they wear suits and they're the boss. And women happily clean toilets and bring up children, and they're very skinny and beautiful. And increasingly, we know about the sexualisation of women and girls, but increasingly now there's a lot of stuff going on TV that says that women are the people who stop men having fun. So this is what we understand, and it becomes our unconscious understanding of reality. So those of us working in prevention have to understand that when we say to people that it's rigid gendered roles and the unequal distribution of power that are not only unfair and unfounded and disadvantage women, they're actually the cause of violence against women. We're actually disrupting people's known things. This stuff is almost cellular to us. So
we're challenging patriarchy.
That's correct, but we understand this from before we're 1 year old. We may as well tell people that the sun rises in the west, because it is so inside ourselves and inside our knowing. So in some ways, I think we have to have some compassion for that. Now, I'm not talking about stepping back from challenging the gendered norms and those sort of things, but we have to have some understanding that when we go out to communities and we're talking with leaders and people who we know can make change, and we're saying, this stuff over here leads to violence here, that the stuff over here that we say we just need to change is something that we are born with, just about. So we have to go at a pace that people can match us with, because we're asking them to defrag and unhinge something that they knew. Now, just because it's not right, just because we know that it is the cause, doesn't mean that it's any easier for people to flick the switch. So we need to have some compassion about that. I think because this is slow work and we have to understand the gravity of what we're asking people to do, we need, as a sector working in prevention, to deeply understand those causes, but not waver about that, understand them. We need to understand what primary prevention is, what we're talking about, and we're talking about stopping violence before it occurs. And we actually need to have a vision. Everybody in this room who works in the prevention of violence against women has to have a vision for what that means, because it's a 20-year vision or a 10-year vision or a lifetime vision, and so we get bunted sideways in it and we can get lost in it. And certainly the people we're asking to make changes can get lost in it. So you have to hold that vision. And I think, if I could take a little sidestep, that I think people that work in this sector are incredibly driven. And we're driven because of the people like Ange who come and tell us their story. And it steels me it infuriates me. That his story is so heart-wrenching. But what it does for me, I'm not very good at working in that part of the sector. I'm much better working where I am. But working in this part of the sector, you have a responsibility to hold the vision, to keep the steel, to understand where we're going, because what we are trying to stop is what happened to Ange. And that's where the relationship between women who are facing what Ange faced and will continue to face, and what we're doing with systems that's the relationship, and we have to hold that.
Thanks, Paddy.
Can I respond to something?
Yes, please.
Is that okay? Is that all right?
Just before you do, I just would like to say that the thing that Paddy was talking about, I think, is about when doing prevention work, meeting people where they're at and having an appreciation of where they're at. And I guess that's around that whole idea of engaging hearts and minds, and you can't engage hearts and minds unless you understand people, have an understanding of where they're at, what their beliefs are and where you need to work from. But having said that, I'll now let...
Yeah, I think this is the issue that really warrants talking about, because this is the dominant view in the kind of so-called engaging men sort of sector, that you have to engage men in positive ways. You have to connect with men in terms of where they're at. Even masculinity issues, like, be the hero. Real men don't bash. My strength is not for hurting. All of these are about kind of connecting with men with where they're at. And I don't know, to me, it's almost like the parallel of an abused woman who walks around on eggshells, because if she says something, she knows if she says the wrong thing, he's going to explode and he's going to be violent. And I just think there's too much walking around on eggshells around this issue, because, yeah, we of course, what I say is going to evoke defensiveness from men. I know that. And then when I get that defensiveness, I then engage with that. I'm interested in what I call the politics of discomfort. I actually want men to feel discomfort. I want them to feel the distress that I feel about this issue. That my eldest daughter fighting off the Balwyn rapists 5 years ago. That distresses me. It fuels my work. I want them to feel distressed by the issue. I want more men to have tears in their eyes listening to Angie's story, And the thing is that if we don't engage men emotionally, and that's going to involve getting defensiveness, then I don't think we ever quite get there. I don't feel the same degree of compassion for men, I suppose, in this regard. I just don't. And I don't know whether the kind of gently kind of approaches are really going to get us there. And maybe it's because, as I said, I went to my first men's violence against women conference 40 years ago, and I'm frustrated by the lack of progress and change. And I want to talk more explicitly and openly about this.
I might be very clear that I have no compassion. My compassion that I'm talking about is not for men who perpetrate violence, just to be very clear about that. One of the quirky things about this work, Bob, is that as women dealing with patriarchy, for me to say to men, you need to... This is not manly, it actually doesn't fly. So this is why we need men like yourself and other men engaged in the conversation and being willing to take leadership roles. That of itself is complex. The notion that we need to have men in leadership roles to say the out loud stuff because men won't listen to us as women is complex. I'm not making any... And we've had a person in a very senior position essentially say to our ACT at Work people, "Don't you worry, ladies, we'll fix this. I don't think you need to be involved. This is men's business." So, kind of the whole thing about, well, this is our problem and we'll fix it and we certainly don't need girls helping us do it. So I think it's a really complex discussion, but I think those of us who are in the conversation together, men and women, we kind of understand. It's like creepy, catchy monkey, or whatever that saying is, that if we do it by stealth, that you and I go out together because we know... Unfortunately, blokes are going to listen to you more than me, then I'm not going to get on my high moral ground and say, well, that's not right. It's not right. We know it's not right, but we have to get there one way or another.
Yeah.
I was just reflecting back on the speakers we had this morning, and Detective Senior Sergeant Cam Davies, he talked about when he's confronted with this, he talked about it as a relationship issue. And then Clementine gave those amazing examples of things in the media around changes that need to happen in terms of how things are reported. And then Paul talked about the approaches we're making at our watch to deal with this. And Fiona McCormack, she was talking about having more women in power. And what this makes, what those examples highlighted was kind of the individual, the organisational, and then the more structural stuff. And I think today what we've been talking about on this panel too are some of those things, like the fact that we need to have a change at the individual level to be working at prevention at the organisational level, and also the structures, which is kind of what Bob's talked about. I just wondered now, I'm not quite sure how much time we've got because the little clock's not doing anything, but I guess my question would be, if you had an open checkbook to do all the prevention initiatives you could, what might that look like?
This was your question. You threw this question in. You should have it prepared.
I think when I threw it in, I said that I didn't feel well equipped to answer. What I'd quite like to do, though, is just sort of throw in thoughts and have a smorgasbord of things. I think it needs to be a really big patchwork, and I'm happy to throw some things in, probably not in a big coherent list altogether. And I'm also interested in what other people would want to throw in. One of them for me would be gender awareness training with kindergarten teachers. Policies that mean that men can learn to be nurturing carers for their children. Respectful relationships education that starts from really young and goes all the way through. Equal pay, not just for the same work, but where work that's traditionally seen as women's work is increased in its value, so that we're actually comparing things across sectors as well. There's a few.
Yeah, and I guess I would want to say, we talk about the importance of moral courage, then let's really pressure politicians and CEOs and people involved in the foundation to show some moral courage and start to name the issues and to use the kind of language that enables us to get at the issues, and not to kind of shy away from the reality that we're talking about men's violence within, and even gender equality language has been kind of co-opted now. Even men's rights groups say they're for gender equality as well. Even that we need to be conscious of when our language gets co-opted. And even the language of gender equality now has been co-opted by backlash groups and can be used against us. And so we have to be mindful about the language we use. I would like to see feminist and pro-feminist think tanks funded outside of the state to come together to talk about these issues outside of the frameworks of government discourses and primary prevention language. And that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see some funding provided to have kind of feminist and pro-feminist think tanks where people come together without being constrained by how we can talk about the issue, to really get to the heart of it, and then work out where the resistances are. And clearly there are going to be resistances. And how do we challenge the resistances? Not accommodate to the resistances, not develop a message that's going to appeal to masculinity, but really to develop messages that actually encourage men to feel some discomfort about their masculinity. I mean, John Stoltenberg provocatively once said, talking about a healthy masculinity is like talking about a healthy cancer. Okay? Masculinity is not the issue. We shouldn't be trying to reconstruct masculinity. Masculinity is at the heart of the problem. We've got to really transform the subjectivities of men so that what it means to be a man and what it means to be masculine is not the issue. We don't want a different kind of real man. We want men to develop a sensibility, a kind of moral selfhood that's not grounded in and connected to the importance of what it is to be a man. Now, I've only begun to think about what that might mean in terms of an educational program, but gee, I'd love to be in a room with 20 people who shared that kind of commitment and that vision to start to tease it out.
In some ways we know the answer to this question, and there's a big research done, and I'm not a academic, so Bob might be able to help me out here, but there was a research done across 40 countries, and the countries that had the lowest rates of violence against women were those that had a government that was supportive of non-violent policies and gender equity policies, etc. They had tools of government that were strong. So in the past in Victoria, I would say the Office of Women's Policy and the amazing work that was done by people here to develop the state plan to prevent violence against women, previous plan. And a strong autonomous feminist sector. And we are very fortunate in Victoria to have the Women's Health Services, been going for 25 years, where our feminist services run for and by women, and we stay like a dog to a bone on the issues that impact on gender equity. And if you think about it, Victoria has led the way in primary prevention of violence against women over 15 years. I've missed Vic Health in that picture, Vic Healthco in that picture as well, developing evidence and doing serious leadership work as an authority that people respect. And so it is no surprise that we have ended up with we've led the work around the foundation being established in Victoria. Now, it's a national organisation, but it's based in Victoria as far as I'm concerned, because we had a systems approach that had government support, we had non-government, we had education, as in what Vic Health did, we had a strong feminist sector. Now, bit by bit over the last few years, that work is being eroded. We now have a Office for Women's Affairs, which I think... No, I'm not going to say any more about that. Sorry. So we actually understand that. I'm a little bit worried at the moment that the foundation is the panacea. So when in the work that I do, and I'm talking to politicians about, you must be funding prevention. It's awesome that you're putting some more dollars, not enough, but more dollars into service delivery. But you're putting nothing more into primary prevention. And their answer is, the foundation will do it. Well, the foundation won't do it. We need much more systemic work going across the state, across all of those different systems that I mentioned, bits of the puzzle, in order for us to really make a difference.
Well, my next question was going to be about the political tensions, but I think we've done that. Unless someone else would like to make a comment.
No, I just know it's more tired.
Oh, okay. Apparently it's time. So I would really like to thank my panel for their very vibrant conversation and discussion, and it's great to have some different views.